In 2023, the Federal Reserve published something that didn't get much attention. 1 in 3 Americans earning over $200,000 a year reported living paycheck to paycheck, not struggling to earn, struggling to keep what they earned. At an income level that puts you in the top 5% of the country, the money was still disappearing. That number should not make sense. And yet, if you've been paying attention to your own finances, some part of it probably does. Here's what that statistic actually reveals. Income does not determine financial outcomes. The relationship between what you earn and where you end up is far weaker than almost anyone believes. 2 people can earn the same salary, work at the same company, and live in the same city. And 15 years later, one of them is financially untouchable, and the other is still one bad month away from a problem. So what actually explains it? It's not luck. It's not discipline in the way people usually mean it. There's a specific set of mechanisms, quiet, structural, almost automatic, that determine which direction money flows after it hits your account. Most people never see them clearly. That's what this video is about. Because if you don't understand the mechanism, you can't interrupt it, and it will keep running regardless of your next raise. My name is Alex, and if you've ever earned more than you expected to and still felt behind, stay with this, because the problem isn't your income, and I'm going to show you the 3 drains pulling money out before it can compound, and the single decision pattern that separates the people who build lasting security from the people who don't. Once you understand how the divergence actually works, you stop waiting for your income to solve it, and start seeing exactly where the gap opens. It opens earlier than most people think, and it almost always starts the same way, not with a catastrophic mistake, but with something that feels, at the time, completely reasonable. Same paycheck, different destiny. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. 2 people, same employer, same salary, same starting point, and yet 20 years later, they are in completely different financial positions. Not slightly different. Not a gap that a few good years could close. Completely different. That is not a thought experiment. It happens constantly. And it probably happens more than you realize in your own professional circle. Take 2 engineers at the same mid-sized firm in Ohio. Both start at $86,000 a year in their early 30s. Same benefits package, same 401k. That's the employer retirement account. Same health plan. From the outside, their financial lives look identical. Fast forward to their early 50s, and one of them is sitting on a net worth north of $600,000, carrying no consumer debt, and starting to think seriously about what life looks like at 58. The other has a net worth closer to $40,000, still carries a car payment and a credit card balance, and has quietly stopped doing the math on retirement because the numbers are too uncomfortable to look at. Same income, same starting conditions, nearly 20 years of the same opportunities. Now you're probably thinking there has to be an explanation, an inheritance, a divorce, a medical crisis, something that accounts for that kind of gap. And sometimes that's true. Life is not perfectly controlled. But in the majority of cases, when you actually trace the numbers back, there is no single catastrophic event on one side. Just a long, quiet divergence that started early and compounded every year after that. This is what makes the invisible divergence so difficult to catch. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like a crisis while it is happening. It feels like normal life. Here is what the data shows. According to the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances, the median net worth of American households in their early 50s sits at around $180,000. But the average, which gets pulled upward by households with significant assets, is closer to $900,000. That gap between median and average is one of the clearest signals in personal finance. It tells you that wealth is not spreading evenly across people with similar incomes. It is concentrating, and the divergence starts much earlier than most people expect. Behavioral economists at Harvard have studied this pattern for years. What they consistently find is that the households that end up in the top tier of wealth accumulation are not, on average, higher earners. They are people who made slightly different decisions with the same dollars repeatedly over a long period of time. The difference is rarely dramatic. It is almost always structural. And here is the part that should make you stop and think. Most of those structural differences are invisible in the moment they happen. A slightly nicer apartment after a promotion, a new car because the old one was paid off, and the payment felt manageable. A credit card balance that never quite gets to zero. None of these feels like defining financial decisions when you make them. They feel like reasonable responses to your current situation, but each one quietly shifts the trajectory. And trajectory, given enough time, is everything. This is not about blame. It is not about discipline in some abstract motivational sense. The people who end up on the wrong side of this divergence are not careless. They are not irresponsible. In many cases, they are doing exactly what they were told to do. Pay your bills. Keep up with your peers. Enjoy the rewards of your work. The advice itself is not wrong. What is missing is an understanding of what is happening underneath it. And what is happening underneath it, quietly in the background of every financial decision you make, is a set of forces that most people never learn to name. The three biggest ones are not complicated, but they are surprisingly easy to miss. And that is exactly what makes them so expensive. The first one alone accounts for the majority of the divergence, and almost everyone who experiences it would tell you they never saw it coming. The leaks nobody talks about. Most people think the problem is that they don't earn enough. The real problem is usually what happens to the money they already have. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Because if the problem is income, the solution is a raise. And a raise is mostly outside your control. But if the problem is structural, if money is leaving through channels you haven't fully mapped, then the solution is visible, and it's available right now, at whatever income you're currently at. Three drains account for the majority of the invisible divergence. They don't show up as emergencies. They show up in normal life. And that is precisely what makes them so effective at hollowing out a financial position over time. The first one is lifestyle inflation, and it is sneaky in a very specific way. Watch how this plays out in practice. A project manager in her mid-30s gets a 12% raise, around $8,000 a year more. She's been in the same apartment for 4 years, so she's upgrading. A little more space, better neighborhood, $500 more a month. She's been driving the same car for 6 years, so she trades up. The new payment is $350 more than the old one. She starts ordering dinner out more often because the longer hours feel like they've earned it. Small things, reasonable things, things that feel like a natural response to earning more. Here's the math on that. Those three adjustments alone account for roughly $10,000 a year in new spending. Her raise was $8,000. She is now cash flow negative compared to where she was before the promotion. She earned more and ended up with less room to move. This is the treadmill. And the reason it's so hard to step off is that none of those individual decisions feel wrong. Each one is justifiable on its own. The problem is the pattern, the near automatic assumption that a higher income unlocks a higher spending level. That assumption is the drain. Currently, the average American household spends 93 cents of every dollar it earns, across all income brackets, including high earners. The spending simply scales with the income, and the gap available for compounding stays thin, regardless of what the paycheck says. The second drain is debt service, and this one has a number attached to it that is worth knowing. The average American household carrying a car loan, a credit card balance, and student debt is sending just over $1,100 a month to lenders, not to savings, not to investments, to interest and principal on money already spent. That is $13,200 a year, leaving the household before a single forward-looking financial decision gets made. Now picture two people with the same job, the same salary. One carries that debt load. The other is debt-free. They have the same income, but they are operating with completely different financial situations. One has $13,000 a year to deploy towards something that grows. The other is using that same money to service the past. Every year, the gap between their positions widens, not because their incomes diverged, but because one of them is paying for decisions made years ago, while the other is building. Debt doesn't just cost interest. It converts your present income into a payment on your past. That's the actual mechanism. The third drain is spending invisibility, and there's real science behind why it happens. Research from MIT found that paying with a credit card activates the brain's reward centers in a way that cash payment does not. The pleasure of acquiring something gets separated from the pain of paying for it. You feel the gain immediately. The cost arrives later, diluted across a statement with 30 other line items, and the brain has largely moved on. The result is what you might call financial background noise, a steady, low-level outflow of small purchases that individually feel trivial and collectively are not. Subscriptions that auto-renew, convenience spending, impulse decisions that disappear from memory before the bill arrives. These three drains are not random. They share a common feature. Each one operates below the level of active decision making. You don't choose lifestyle inflation. You drift into it. You don't decide to become debt dependent. It accumulates. You don't consciously opt for spending and visibility. The system is designed to make the friction disappear. Understanding that the drains are structural, not personal failures, is actually a useful insight, because the structure can be changed, but only once you can see it clearly. And seeing it clearly requires understanding what you're actually competing against. Because while money is quietly leaving through these three channels, time is doing something on the other side of the ledger that most people deeply underestimate. The compounding gap between someone who starts early and someone who waits is one of the most counterintuitive numbers in personal finance, and it rarely lands the way people expect it to. The compounding gap. Nobody really feels compound interest. That's the problem. You can understand it intellectually, you can nod along to the explanation, but the human brain is genuinely bad at intuiting exponential growth. We think in straight lines. Compounding doesn't move in a straight line. It moves slowly, then all at once. And by the time most people feel it, the window where it would have mattered most has already closed. This is why the timing of when you start investing is not just important. It is arguably the single most consequential financial variable in a person's life, more than income, more than which stocks you pick, more than almost any other decision you will make with money. Let me show you what that actually looks like in numbers. Take two nurses, both starting their careers in their late 20s at the same hospital, earning the same salary. The first one, call her Diana, starts putting $500 a month into a low-cost index fund at age 27. She does this for 10 years, then stops completely at 37. She never adds another dollar. The second nurse, call her Renee, waits until she's 37 to start. Same $500 a month, same index fund. But Renee invests for 30 years straight, all the way to 67, never misses a month, at a 7% average annual return, which is roughly the long-term historical average of the US stock market after inflation. Here is what happens. Diana invested for 10 years. Her total contribution is $60,000. At 67, her account has grown to approximately $472,000. Renee invested for 30 years. Her total contribution is $180,000. 3 times as much money invested, over 3 times as many years. At 67, her account sits at approximately $567,000. Renee ends up ahead, but only barely, and she had to put in 3 times the money to get there. That is the compounding gap in its clearest form. Diana's 10-year head start was worth so much that Renee needed an additional 20 years of contributions just to pull slightly ahead. The math is not intuitive. It does not feel like it should work that way, but it does every time, because compounding rewards time more than it rewards effort. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Most people don't start at 27, they start later, if they start at all. Currently, the median retirement account balance for Americans between the ages of 45 and 54 is around $134,000. For a household that will need somewhere between $1 and $1.5 million to retire with any real security, that number represents a significant gap. And the reason that gap exists, in the majority of cases, is not that people failed to earn enough. It's that the clock started late. Every decade of delay doesn't just push retirement further away. It roughly doubles the monthly contribution required to reach the same destination. Wait 10 years to start, and you don't fall 10 years behind. You fall much further than that because you lose the years where compounding does its heaviest lifting. Think about what that means practically. A 35-year-old who starts investing $500 a month today and stays consistent has a credible path to financial security by their mid-60s. A 45-year-old trying to reach the same outcome needs to invest closer to $1,100 a month. Same destination, more than double the monthly cost. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual math of a delayed start. And this is the part that most financial conversations skip over. They talk about how much to invest. They rarely talk about the catastrophic cost of waiting to decide. Time is not a soft factor in this equation. It is the primary variable. Everything else is secondary. Which brings up a question worth sitting with. If starting early matters this much, why do so many people wait? Part of the answer is behavioral. The drains from the previous section leave little room to invest, but part of it is something else entirely. Something that operates below the level of budgeting or cash flow. It has to do with how money actually moves once debt enters the picture, and how carrying it quietly shuts down the asset engine before it ever gets a chance to run. The trade you don't see coming. Here's a question most people never think to ask. Two people receive the exact same $5,000 bonus. Same amount, same day. 5 years later, one of them is meaningfully wealthier than the other. What happened in between? The answer has nothing to do with skill, luck, or even how hard either of them worked. It has everything to do with whether debt was present in the equation. This is the mechanism that the previous section was pointing toward. The compounding gap explained why time is the primary variable in building financial security. But there is something that closes the window on compounding before it ever gets started. And that something is carrying debt into decisions that should be building assets. Here is how it plays out in practice. Two accountants at the same firm, same salary, same bonus structure. Call them Marcus and Joel. Both receive a $5,000 bonus at the end of the year. Marcus carries about $6,500 in credit card debt at an average interest rate of 21.5%, which is currently the national average. He does the responsible thing. He puts the bonus toward the balance. Smart move. His debt drops. But after that transaction, his net position from that bonus is essentially zero. The $5,000 existed, moved through his hands, and produced nothing going forward. Joel is debt-free. He takes the same $5,000 and puts it into a low-cost index fund. At a 7% average annual return, that $5,000 becomes approximately $9,800 in 10 years. In 20 years, it is approximately $19,300. He did nothing after the initial decision. The money did the work. Same bonus. Completely different outcomes. The only variable was whether debt was present to intercept the capital before it could compound. And this is what people mean when they say debt robs your future. It is not just the interest charges, though those are real and significant. It is the opportunity cost. Every dollar sent to a lender is a dollar that cannot compound. Every month of debt service is a month where your income is partially funding the past instead of building the future. The debt trap is not that it costs money. It is that it converts your financial present into a payment plan for your financial past. Now let's look at the asset side of this equation, because the same logic applies in reverse, and the numbers are just as striking. The average new vehicle price in the US currently sits at just over $48,000. The average monthly payment on a new car loan is around $735. At an average interest rate of just under 7% over a 68-month term. Those are real numbers, and most people sign off on them without running what the alternative actually looks like. Here is the alternative. A dentist in her early 40s, call her Claire, decides to buy a used car for $12,000 cash instead of financing a new one. She has no monthly car payment. She takes that $735 a month and invests it instead. At 7% annual return over 10 years, that decision, the choice to redirect one monthly payment, produces approximately $121,000. Claire does not feel wealthy in year one. She is driving a used car while her colleagues pull into the parking lot in something newer. But she is not actually behind. She is 10 years into building a $121,000 asset, one monthly payment at a time, using money that everyone around her is sending to a lender. That is the asset engine. It is not complicated. It does not require a high income or unusual discipline. It requires understanding the difference between a decision that builds your balance sheet and one that slowly drains it, and then making that distinction the default filter for every significant financial choice. The car example is useful because it is concrete and familiar, but the same logic applies to every major spending decision: housing, renovations, discretionary purchases financed on credit. The question is always the same. Is this putting money into my pocket over time or taking it out? Knowing the answer requires more than math, though. It requires understanding why people consistently choose the drain over the engine, even when they know better. And that is not a budgeting problem. It is a behavioral one. The wiring behind every decision. Knowing something and doing something are not the same thing. And in personal finance, that gap between knowledge and behavior is where most of the damage actually happens. By this point in the video, the mechanisms are clear. Lifestyle inflation drains the surplus. Debt intercepts capital before it can compound. Waiting too long to invest is brutally expensive. The math is not complicated. And yet, millions of people who understand all of this still end up on the wrong side of the divergence, not because they are uninformed, not because they lack access to the right tools, but because something deeper is running underneath every financial decision they make, something that no spreadsheet or budgeting app ever touches. That something is the behavioral engine, and it runs whether you're aware of it or not. Here is what the research actually shows. Behavioral economists at Princeton and the University of Chicago have studied financial decision-making for decades. What they consistently find is that financial behavior is not primarily driven by information. It is driven by how people emotionally relate to money, specifically by the underlying beliefs about scarcity and security that formed long before anyone opened a brokerage account. There are two distinct patterns, and the split between them explains more of the invisible divergence than any other single variable. The first pattern is what researchers call scarcity orientation. People operating from this position experience money primarily as a source of anxiety. There is a persistent low-grade fear that there will not be enough, even when the income is objectively sufficient, and that fear produces two opposite but equally destructive behaviors. The first is hoarding, keeping cash in a savings account, earning 1%, because investing it feels like risking losing it. This feels like caution. It presents itself as responsibility, but it is actually a form of fear dressed up as prudence. A financial advisor in his late 40s, call him Raymond, kept $200,000 in a high-yield savings account for 6 years because the market felt too uncertain to invest. He told himself he was being careful. What he was actually doing was watching inflation quietly erode his purchasing power, while the market returned an average of just over 10% annually during that same period. His caution cost him somewhere in the range of $140,000 in foregone growth. He never made a single bad investment. He just never made one at all. The second behavior scarcity produces is the opposite: impulse spending. When money feels scarce and unpredictable, the psychological response is often to spend it before it disappears. If it's going to be gone anyway, the brain reasons, better to have something to show for it now. This is not irrationality. It is a completely logical response to a felt experience of financial instability, but it feeds directly into the three drains from Section 2, and it keeps the compounding window permanently closed. The second pattern is what researchers call abundance orientation, and it is worth being precise about what this actually means, because it is not optimism, and it is not confidence in the naive sense. It is a functional belief that money is a renewable, deployable resource, that more can be made, that a dollar invested today is not a dollar lost. It is a dollar working. People operating from this position make different decisions with identical information. They are not less afraid of loss. They simply do not let the fear of loss become the primary filter on every financial choice. They can leave money in an index fund during a market correction because their felt relationship with that money is not one of scarcity. They can drive the used car because they are not using consumption to manage anxiety about financial insecurity. Here is what matters most about this. Behavioral orientation is not fixed. It is not a personality trait you are born with. Research from the University of Michigan shows that deliberate exposure to accurate financial information, specifically understanding the mechanisms behind outcomes, rather than just the outcomes themselves, measurably shifts financial behavior over time. Seeing the math clearly changes the felt relationship with money. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently. Which is exactly why understanding the full picture matters more than any individual tip or tactic. And the full picture, the drains, the compounding gap, the asset engine, the behavioral layer underneath all of it, points toward one thing, not a mindset shift in the abstract. A concrete, practical blueprint for what to actually do differently, starting now. Now you can see it. Here is what this video was actually about. It was never really about income. It was about the gap between what money does when it is left to default patterns and what it does when those patterns are understood and interrupted. The divergence is not random. Lifestyle inflation scales your spending to match every raise before you ever see the benefit. Debt converts your present income into a payment on your past. Waiting on compounding is not a delay. It is a permanent cost. And underneath all of it, a felt relationship with money that was never examined is quietly making decisions on your behalf. That is the mechanism. And now you can see it. So here is what to watch for going forward. Notice where money moves in the first 48 hours after it arrives. That window reveals more about your financial trajectory than any budget ever will. There is a related question this video did not answer. If the behavioral engine is what ultimately drives outcomes, what actually changes it, and how permanently? That is worth understanding next. If this reframed something for you, share it with someone who is asking the same questions, and subscribe, because this is one of a series of conversations, and the next one builds directly on this one.